Afghanistan Project Podcast. I'm your host, Beth Bailey, and today my guest is Art Conaghan, a public affairs specialist in the UK who was a Parliamentary Chief of Staff for an MP in Northampton outside of London at the time of the withdrawal from Afghanistan. I advise listeners to get a good drink and settle in because Art's story is another incredible example of how lives were utterly transformed during the withdrawal just around the world. So I was floored, Art, when I first talked to you, and it's going to be great having you here today. Thanks for being here with me.
Thank you very much, Beth. A pleasure to be on this podcast.
Just for everybody's background, when I first talked to Art, he said he didn't think he had a story. And as soon as he started talking, I said, you have an amazing story. So I'm sure you're all going to agree with me. And I'd love to get started by just asking you, I know the answer already. Art, tell me about your experience with Afghanistan prior to August of 2021 and, what was going on at the time of the withdrawal for you and how you got kind of pulled into what was happening.
Well, previous to 2021, not a huge amount. I knew about Afghanistan because I had friends in the British military who had served there. And I think, there were two things I always remember about Afghanistan. One is a journalist called Sandy Gall, who's still alive. He's about 97 or something like this. And he was a British journalist that embedded himself with the Mujahideen in the 1980s and did all of these reports and wrote wonderful books about it. And I remember sort of watching those documentaries in the 1980s. But of course, it was very, in some respects, it was very stylized. The Mujahideen were just utter heroes. And in a James Bond movie, they were Oxford educated on horseback. And then the second one, which I think was the big one, was 9/11. I was working in the city centre of Dublin. A colleague collared me, took me next door into a hotel, and I was there probably about 5 minutes before the second jet had gone into the World Trade Center, and it was a jaw-dropping moment. And then obviously everything cascaded from that, but no direct involvement at all. I knew the local Afghan leader, but I had no idea of the size of the Afghan community. And when excuse my French, when the shit hit the fan, I found that there were over 1,000 people there in this small market town, of 250,000 people, less than 250,000 people living there. And that was it. So no real in-depth knowledge or anything like that. And then obviously July and August 2021, everything changed.
Tell me about the spinning up process of getting involved. I think it started for you with a tweet. So tell us about the tweet and about how everything kind of drew out of that, because I've heard you talk about Afghanistan, the country, the provinces, all of these things. And so what was that like, learning about all of that and getting involved in the various things going on in the country?
Well, we have a thing in our office. I do all the communications, but our agreement with my boss, the MP, was that we would always have a second signature on before we send out any communications or anything like that. So I would put a tweet together, I would send it to him, he would okay it or change it, and that would it. So a two-tier thing, so we don't put anything out. But on this occasion, I didn't. He was in a meeting. And I just put out a tweet, basically saying, if you are affected in Northampton, if you're an Afghan and affected by this crisis, we're here to help. Please get in contact if you are a constituent. And over the next few days, I mean, my cell number is out there on my business card. Everyone in the community would have my cell number. And within days, I was receiving direct tweets, WhatsApp messages, telephone calls, emails, and it had gone pretty viral and way beyond the people that would have no contact whatsoever but that was just an indication, because if you remember July and August, that states collapsed quickly, and it happened really quickly. If you remember, President Biden said we want to be out by the anniversary of 9/11. Well, that was put forward a lot, and there was a sense of huge panic, and that's what started the process. And yeah, that was that's what happened. Our office just got inundated from emails from people who had no contact with us, or no relationship with us, and most of them we couldn't help. We did help some, but that was at a later date when things had died down.
Sure, yeah, I think it's hard to figure out how can you help in those early stages, but you told me that the Afghan population really stepped up in the midst of this crisis. What was it like working with this community that you'd not previously really interacted with, and what were your feelings about the spirit of the Afghan people from those interactions?
To be honest, it was more to do with the leader, and I'll call him Kush. He has a story in itself. His father was, I think, number 2 or number 3 in the NDS, which was the security service under President Najibullah. And in 1997, when the Taliban won control of most of Afghanistan, they tortured and executed publicly President Najibullah, and Kush's father was also executed by the Taliban. So all of his family, the men, the boys, really more than anything, back in 97, sneaked out and illegally came into Britain for asylum, and have settled here, and settled mostly in and around Northampton, and they've become quite successful businessmen. And I can't tell you, I mean, there was a desperation on their side, because they were, they wanted to get their people out, but everyone rallied together, to be honest. In some respects, the Afghans, I mean, they're great people. I mean, they're so hospitable. I mean, they really are. Once you sit down with them and actually listen to their stories, and the one thing that you get out of crises like these, in times of shock and crisis and chaos and things like that, it is the things that you equally share that come together, and you recognize. You don't recognize the differences. You see the humanity, the desperation, the hospitality, and all of those sort of emotions that come through. And that's something that I experienced in shovelfuls, not just from the Afghan community. I'm going to actually put this one out on whatever. The amount of financial and moral support from Jewish communities to those Muslims is not well recorded. It is, when the Palestine crisis happened last year, some of the Afghans were coming to me, said, "What are you going to do about Gaza? This is terrible, etc. And these Zionists are this and that and whatever." And I had to sort of remind them that, your father-in-law was funded with Jewish money in Britain, in Australia, whatever, that came forward and helped pay for your father-in-law's extraction. So, just put that in mind. So yeah, I got to know a lot of Afghans, especially when they started arriving in the hotels, and I took one on his work experience. He was the oldest work experienced person I ever had, but he was so well educated. He worked in the UN in Kabul on children. Supporting children's services, couldn't get a job, so I just took him in under my wing, paid for his train travel down to Westminster, and give him a couple of weeks work experience so he could put that on his CV. So yeah.
That's really incredible, and I think it's really important to bring that out. This is a non sequitur from what we're talking about now, but you brought up what support the Jewish community has given to Afghans, and I've talked to groups that started just because they saw what was coming for Afghan women, and they wanted to be able to help, and those groups are still helping Afghan women try to get out. They have not given up the fight, and you're right, it doesn't get much coverage, but the non sequitur portion of this is I'm a media fellow for a small group of very vocal allies of Afghanistan, the Global Friends of Afghanistan, and they recently came after some Taliban affiliates recently came after all of our members, saying things like, you're a CIA asset, and this person's a weapons manufacturer, and this person's, a British spy, and just absolute nonsense. If you're looking at the people, you have to laugh. But what they said about me, because I cover anti-Semitism, was that I was an Israel affiliate, and they couldn't even spell Israel properly. And it made me really angry. I think that we've lost that sense of combined humanity that was so present during those early days, right? When Jewish Afghans were fleeing the country, when Christian Afghans were fleeing the country because they knew what was coming. And I think it's so important to remember those days. It's almost like the day after 9/11. 9/11 was a tragedy, but after that, people united and said, we're not going to let this stay a tragedy. And I think that there were those moments during the withdrawal where we all came together and we all felt so, compelled to do things for people that we didn't even know and to make a great difference in the world. And I would love to see that happen now still and continue, because the pain hasn't ceased after Afghanistan. It's only radiated out into other parts of the world. So sorry for for anybody who's listening who didn't want to hear that diatribe. I'm sorry, not sorry, but we can get back on course, I swear. Art, I want to hear about the early days of coordinating operations. You've got all these people coming to you for help. What did you do? What were the priorities? What were some of the stories that you recall from the early days? And what was it like for you? I've heard so many people who were sleepless here for days and weeks and months at a time, and I want to know if it was the same for you.
Well, probably the best thing to do is just maybe step back a little bit and look at how that came in. There were a couple of disparate things that happened. So I joined Westminster. So I used to work in the European Parliament, then came in on the 2017 general election. So I had about 3 or 4 years in. And as a chief of staff, I mean, my boss is very much domestic orientated, education, planning, councils, that sort of thing, and whatever, where I'd be a lot more international relations, geopolitics interested, etc., counter-terrorism, that sort of thing. Coming from Northern Ireland, of course, you would just have an interest in those sorts of issues. So there were basically a couple of things that happened. One, I have some friends in military intelligence, and there was about 5 or 6 of us, and we set up a group called Campaign Force, and that was like a community interest company, non-profit, that was to give insight and training to veterans, and this came out, and this is coming out of Afghanistan and Iraq, veterans and reservists who are interested in getting involved in political life. And through that work, and also supporting a local battalion in the constituency that has their headquarters there, I spent a lot of time helping and supporting the military in that way. So my network within the military spread pretty rapidly. I would take senior NCOs and officers down from our local battalion down into Westminster, did a private tour for them, would organise meetings with ministers who were veterans, and some great people on the Defence Select Committee to sit down with them, and as part of what's called their ALDP, that's our Army Leadership and Development Programme. That's a programme in for your sort of NCOs and senior NCOs. Give them a bit of idea of some of like how policy is made and how that impacts on the military community. And I met up with a lot of people, from reservists to a brigadier in special forces, and Australians even as well, who were in the Australian Armed Forces. So I developed over that 4 years a pretty good solid network. And then the other part was COVID. So COVID was a game changer. It was about a year and a half before. Everyone was locked down. We hadn't heard of Zoom or Teams or anything like that. WhatsApp groups sprung up everywhere. Suddenly staffers were getting access into briefings because of the technology. Before you would have a briefing of maybe like a few dozen members of parliament and someone from a department or a specialist in a room. Staff were excluded, and suddenly you would have these 1,000, 800, 1,000 sort of people on a WhatsApp or a Teams meeting, having a briefing on COVID, on vaccines, whatever. So your whole life suddenly went digital, and I think all MPs were the same. Our casework quadrupled, and so we were on action stations, and that was really the dry run. So by the time that Afghanistan happened in July, August or whatever, we were sort of ready to rock and roll. We had a capacity that we didn't have before, and basically I just tapped into all of those networks. People within the Foreign Office I knew, some special advisors, people that worked who were civil servants in the Cabinet Office. I tapped in heavily to negotiate, and basically what my role is, and one of my roles in Parliament is a navigator. I help outside external organisations navigate in, especially when there's a crisis. And all MPs have this access to hotlines to every department, every quango, every organisation. So if you had a particular tax issue that you weren't getting anywhere and you wanted to appeal or complain, we would have a direct number into the tax office, or we would have a direct number into the Foreign Office, and we would have these dry runs like in Sudan, Somalia and places like that where there are little crises. We would contact, we would email on people's behalf, and we would manage those. Afghanistan was different because you were talking about hundreds of thousands of people trying desperately to get to safety. So the first thing was trying to negotiate what I didn't know immediately. So what you would normally do is I would have something like someone would come to me and say, well, my father-in-law, and so the first thing I did was, we had our briefings, I would try and get them up and running under ARAP. Now, ARAP is the Afghanistan Relocation and Assistance Program. It has a very, very singular mandate, which is people who were employed and worked as interpreters, worked directly for the British Army that would be vulnerable and could be targeted. And then you would have higher level people under ACRS, which is another system, but that wasn't there was no direct access to that. So that would have been politicians, ministers, female judges. And I will tell you about, if you're interested, the Afghan junior women's football team, how we helped get them sanctuary. And we would send off emails to the Foreign Office, and then that would be the first thing. The second part, or the Foreign Office and the Home Office and the Ministry of Defence, those are the three main agencies. They would have their emergency teams in place, trying to get them on the system. The second one then, where if we have any breaks, is that's where I deploy the MP. So I deploy the MP to go and try and talk to the minister or the private parliamentary secretary for the department. There's normally a couple of those MPs. They're not technically ministers, but they are the gateways into ministers and secretaries of state. And then we would sort of hammer that up and escalate it. But really, it's very entrepreneurial. You just try and find and navigate a way. You pull on your networks, and you break the rules. You bend them, to be polite. And that's what you do, and you try and get your own way and get a result. And that's what happened in August and September of 2021.
Yeah, when you told me about this the other day, I think you called yourself a human smuggler. You were a human smuggler for like 6 months, I believe, were your words. And I almost spat out my coffee because that's what everybody had to be, right? You were doing things, you had to make your own channels because the official ones weren't working. I mean, I've had people on this podcast who got calls from senior leaders at the Pentagon saying, help me get my guy out. And the dude's like, I'm no one. Why are you calling me? You know, you are obviously trying to utilize those channels, but I know on the U.S. side, there are just people had no idea what was going on. And in fact, the best thing that would help you was if you had a contact on the ground inside HKIA. And it's just incredible to hear those stories and to hear about the levels of effort that were all going on simultaneously, and the ones that bore fruit and the ones that didn't. And so I would love to hear about the groups you were helping to escape. I'd love to start with women's football team, or as we call it here, the women's soccer team.
Yeah, soccer. Yeah, absolutely. I'm a rugby fan, by the way, so I'll hold my hand up. So I had a friend who was a defence attaché. He was a former colonel. He was a mediations and East Africa specialist. I helped him before. I got to know him, had lunch with him, had meetings with him, and he was trying to have various initiatives, and he wanted access into the foreign. Was finding some blockages, so I helped him. I managed to get a report in front of the Foreign Secretary. That opened some doors with him. He was grateful. And then he called on me again. I'm trying to remember all of this. So it wasn't me. So I was just a small cog. But the Afghan women's junior soccer team obviously needed to get out. There was an organization called Rocket. There's a woman called Suan Gill, I think it was, from ROKIT, which is this American charity organization, humanitarian charity organization. They were doing the lion's share of the work. And I was asked to basically open up channels to start basically getting down and lobbying MPs, ministers, etc., open doors. And like I said, I used up 8 of my 9 cat political lives. Put them in contact with special advisors, trying to find a door, just open. There were a few MPs who were, one in particular, I'm sort of a bit reticent to tell her name, but you will probably guess, but she was in a Foreign Office, she was in the Foreign Affairs Select Committee, and she was just I'm going to mention her. Her name is Alicia Cairns. If you want to talk about Afghanistan, you have to talk about Alicia Cairns, because she went over and she's in a neighbouring constituency, over and above duty, and this is where the people smuggler thing came in, because we just did what we had to do. We didn't ask permission. And it was like halfway through you realise, hang on, I went to a friend in the cabinet office, put me in contact with a Jewish lawyer woman in Australia that had a humanitarian organisation that got together some money, put me in contact with an NGO in Kabul to get some money together to bribe the Taliban to get this family across the place in Spin Bulldog. So all of this was going on really fast. You weren't stopping to think about whether you were breaking the law or not, or whatever. When you look back at that now, I don't care. And if it were to happen again, I would just be au fait, I can break a few more laws or whatever, because you were making a difference between life and death. This particular family, the father of the family had 3 assassination attempts. He was a senior commander. We tried to get him on ARAP. We couldn't get anywhere. We didn't get anywhere because the system was dysfunctional. So the bad part about COVID was that we didn't realize at the time when we were sending emails off to the Foreign Office, they weren't being read. There were hundreds of thousands of emails that were just on a server not being read, and we were getting desperate. So I had a friend who's a major in the parachute regiment who said, well, look, I've got the Secretary of State Defence's personal email address. Send the stuff over. I will get it eyes on. And once I had that eyes on with the Secretary of State Defence, the ball started rolling. We couldn't get the family across the border. He had a Taliban death sentence issued against him when he was operating. He was very vulnerable to the Pakistan ISI because he had, he had, well, I'm not going to go there. And so we were desperate to get him out because he didn't quite fit with ARAP, and we were desperate to get him out. So we were using all the technology. I mean, and this was the thing, we used WhatsApp with the MOD and some specialist people. I used What's 3 words, so I could put to them the exact location, the exact floor. I had photographs, everything, for an extraction team to come if maybe we'd set all of these sort of things up. And it never happened. So eventually, through the help of the humanitarian lawyer, who has just been outstanding, and we tried to get him into Iran. We tried to get him into India. He got him a visa for India, but the visas had dried up, these emergency visas that were issued, but that didn't include his family. He wouldn't go into Pakistan. We managed to convince him to go, and then the deal fell through with the Taliban in Spin Baldock. He had a grandchild with him that was like a year old. It was dehydrated. It was awful. We were using. I'm not sure I haven't listened to any of your podcasts, so forgive me, but I don't know if you've been aware of Digital Dunkirk, which was the WhatsApp, Telegram, Signals messaging. We lent in heavily. We were all part of that. We were getting really useful J2 from Kabul down to the road, down through Kandahar, right through into Spin Baldock. So there were ANA commandos who were going through there that were relating that intelligence into a group of British Special Forces and veterans, and then we were leaning into that. So one person in our group would have been into another group, and we were sharing intelligence. There was one time I had to put a shout out for some ANA commandos were stuck in a village. They had no food, no rations, no arms, no ammunition, and they needed to regroup and they needed information. And so we helped put that word out onto the groups. They managed to get re-equipped. They were on the way to the Panjshir Valley, and last I heard they sort of made it. And those British soldiers and Americans who had served with the ANA commandos would have given their right limbs to save those guys, and those guys were outstanding. I mean, those guys were gritty. They were going to fight to the end, and if they were holed up and the Taliban around, they were going to shoot them. They were just going to, they were not afraid. And so there was lots of different layers going on, and you were carefully trying to sort of negotiate out and around. But that was the panic phase. That was up to the 15th post of August, and trying to get people out. And the Afghan women's team, was just putting it out to various MPs and ministers, etc., providing the case. Leeds United football team sponsored them, said that it would take care of their accommodation, and they were successful, and they got there. And the second part then was soon after that, in about September, October, I sponsored a committee room, one of those grand old committee rooms in the House of Parliament, for the founding meeting of we have these things that are not committees, they're run just by MPs, are very loose organisations called APPGs, all party parliamentary groups. So you have to have people from different political parties to come together. They can't be just a Conservative or a Liberal or a Labour Party. They have to have a number of different political parties in, and we helped set up, and I'll show you the photographs afterwards because I photographed it, the inaugural meeting of the Afghan Women's All-Party Parliamentary Group. So we had all sorts of NGOs, and it was there I met the CEO of an organisation that I'm still in contact with today, amazing organisation called SEPR International. They're based down in Hereford, where the SAS are headquartered, and I think they took out about 32,000 Afghans to safety all over the world, America, Poland, Germany, everywhere. I mean, they were just the CEO was just an amazing guy. I got to know the owner, who had lived there for a long time in Kabul. He used to cycle up to Pagnam, and he was just telling me about the place, and he was just, and what was really interesting about the owner, and this is after, is that he was giving, even a year, 2 years after, like tens of thousands of dollars out of his own pocket to support Afghans in Islamabad and in Iran and places like that, to make sure that they had their rent paid and food and all the rest of it. And technically it's a security risk management company that does, heat and HEFAT training, hostile environment awareness training and first aid training and things like that. And they would have people all over Africa and the Middle East and things, in Israel and Syria. They work there. They have fixers and everything to help journalists and NGOs operate, and that sort of thing, and whatever. But what I discovered about SEPR is that deep down they were very humanitarian. They were really a humanitarian organisation. And they were making contracts to get people out, but it wasn't just about the money. And that was a heartening meeting with those people and getting to know them and helping get people out, especially around the triples and things.
Yeah, I'd love to have you talk about the triples, because going back to your story about getting folks out, getting the man out who was targeted for death, right? We have so many people. I remember in the early days of my coverage of the post-withdrawal scene, when I got into all those groups that you're talking about on the UK side, we had those in the US too, just, all working together to try to support these Afghans who were left behind. And so many of them, for us, our allies, our special forces allies, didn't qualify for SIV, right? They knew their fingerprints were in databases, and nobody knew yet which databases the Taliban had access to and what they would be able to tell. And so they're trying to get out of the country. They're largely being supported by other organizations. They're not qualifying for SIV. If they do go to the passport office, they have to get their fingerprints taken. I mean, it was just such a deadly and devastating situation. And there were a lot of people kicking themselves saying, I should have broken the law and gotten this guy out. Or people who, one of the first stories I covered for Fox News was a Green Beret who had worked alongside an Afghan commando and orchestrated his evacuation himself, getting him through Iran. It took 3 times trying to get through Iran into Turkey, where he's living as an illegal immigrant, just waiting, And so we've got all these people who worked with our elite units in the US side who are in incredible danger. And when you told me about the triples, to me it sounded like just like that situation. So I would love to have you talk about what the triples did, just for some background of who they were, where they were, what they did, and then what their prospects were after the withdrawal happened.
Well, as you know, in Afghanistan, I mean, the initial sweep in 2001 with the Green Berets and, and the Northern Alliance, etc., to crush the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. I mean, a textbook example of what a counterinsurgency operation really looks like. A few hundred operatives of CIA and Green Berets, the might of the US Air Force, and the bulk of it was local units coming down. After that time, so in 2002, really was end of 2001, started 2002, the British, because it was a NATO-led operation at that stage, decided to set up in Logar province, just south of Kabul, an organization called Commando Force 333, okay, CF 333. And they were set up for counter-narcotics work. They were under the directorate, I can't remember if it's a GD or GC PSU, they've changed their name since, the General Directorate of Police Special Units, or the General Command of Police Special Units. The last commander of that lives about an hour away from me, Mirahab Azimi. He was a major general in that, and that's what they were originally set up of. And then very quickly, as the threat of Taliban came, they had added, they started off with about 150 people and went up to about 300. So they're basically like a large company size force. They got involved in COIN and CT work as well. And they set up a number of other organizations. So there was one with the US 7 Special Forces Group called the CRU, the Crisis Response Unit 222. They were based in Kabul, and they could be sent at a moment's notice to any part of the country, whether it's crises, hostage rescue, that sort of stuff. And then you had a series, I think there were about 4 of them. There were various other commando units as well, but these ones, the triples, there was Afghan territorial forces. So you had the triple force, and they were all geographically located. So the 444 ended up, they looked after Kandahar. And they were originally under the tutelage of the British forces, but then got transferred over to the Polish GROM, the Polish Special Forces. You had 555s were Herat, so the Italians were in there, so they worked very closely with the Italians. 888s were Balk, that was Germany. And then you had the Nangarhar, the 888s, and they were with UK forces. So they were they were the tip of the spear for the Afghan fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and ISIS-K and all the rest of it. Their story doesn't really come in that time, there were, like CF 333 provided security around Abbey Road and around there with American and British paratroopers, etc., before they were taken out. And the commanding officer of 333 is a good friend of mine. He lives 15 minutes away from me. He's a great guy, and he still gets calls every week. The spotlight on Afghanistan has gone. It went to Ukraine in 2022. Then it's Israel, Iran, now Syria. Spotlights changed, priorities changed, but people are still being hunted down by the Taliban. I hear these stories. I've seen gruesome videos. I don't really want to talk about where they have found people from the Triples. They are desperate. And there's a subtext story to this, because now these are only allegations. There were allegations that the UK Special Forces SAS between 2010 and 2013 where some members were involved in extrajudicial killings. And there is a government inquiry at the moment called the Hatton Cave inquiry that's been run by Sir Charles Hatton Cave. And there is a further allegation that complicated the issue around the Triples, which was basically they would need clearance from senior officers in Hereford, whether they got ARAP, they were approved. So there's a process that goes through in various boards, etc. There was an allegation that some of these Afghans in the Triples were not let in and not awarded ARAP and humanitarian refuge, because should they come into the country, they would then be called up to give evidence in the inquiry if they had operated between 2010 and 2013. Those are only allegations, so I won't say anything more. Suffice to say that this came out in the papers. It was a bit of a scandal, and a review was put into process by the Ministry of Defence. We had an election in July, and my guy was voted out. And this year, even though I was working as a sort of a freelancer, I was sort of helping take up the case for the Triples on their behalf. So I met up with a Hereford MP. He was to make representations. I was meeting up with my own MP, and then thankfully a statement was made in the House of Commons, and about 500 have got through. They're not all through yet, but they're in the process of, which is good. So the taps have been opened again, and they seem to be getting through. So like I said, the Taliban are on missions. There's a lot going on there. Some of them, there's so many awful stories. Some of them managed to make it to Iran. There were a lot of pressure from the Iranians for them to join up and go to Ukraine and fight on behalf of the Russians. Otherwise, their family might be, or they'll send them. They were threatening to send them back to Afghanistan, and so there's all sorts of, and they were feeling very, very lost. But thankfully now, at least in Britain, those taps seem to be open, and we seem to be coming to a resolution. So while the spotlight is away from Afghanistan, we are still there, and that was the final thing. So that's the story. My little side of the story of the Triples.
That's not a small number of people that you helped unclog that backup for. And I was going to ask you later about. I've always referred to it as ARAP because I have never heard of other people using it. And I guess you guys pronounce it differently, but. The first time I was introduced to it was from someone who had worked with the British military, and he had also worked with various NGOs, and the government would not respond to him from the UK. He could not get a response about ARAP, and he was devastated. His wife was evacuated because she was renowned, and I won't explain why, because I don't know if he ever left the country. I never heard from him, but he would include me on his very angry emails to the British government. Up until last Christmas was the last time I saw an email from him. But anytime I've heard about ARAP, it sounded just like the SIV program, riddled with issues. And so I would love to have you talk about what that scheme has been like, and, whether this was, was that a holdup for everyone? Is there a reason why people didn't hear? What was going on with that whole process?
See, Beth, it was multifaceted. So to be sort of non-partisan and see it through the eyes of the MOD or the Home Office or the Foreign Office. First, interdepartmental scraps. Right, so that's the one thing. So the MOD would have issues with the Home Office would have issues with the Foreign Office, etc., about the level of checks, or whether those checks with the biometric checks will be done in Islamabad, or whether they're going to be done in the UK. And the Home Office was saying, no, it has to be done in Islamabad. You have to do all the checks there. And so the multifaceted side of things were the different pressures. So one is national security, because we do know that some triples and some Afghan commandos and interpreters were killed by the Taliban. No one knew that they were killed, and they were trying then, and they were quite sophisticated, trying to get people in. So I do know from my experience here in Northampton, I highlighted up to Special Branch that there was a family in the hotel. I only found out about a few months after that were not Afghan. They were from the tribal areas. They were Urdu speakers. They were not Afghans, and they were fundamentalists. They were Islamicists, and they had somehow got on. So there was a security element of it. There was also the fact of, where do we put these people? Where do we get the contracts? How do we get them? It was COVID, so they had to be isolated to one type of hotel into another hotel. How do we get them set up? Then how do we get them housing afterwards? Because the immigration levels, the housing shortages, the COVID chaos had defenestrated government departments. People, the emails weren't getting read in the Foreign Office because everyone was working from home, so it just didn't have the same impact. The MOD were much better, being a lot of military people. They were focused in the office, and once the ball got rolling, but you're talking about 100,000 Arab applications. That's, average family in Afghanistan's 4.5 children, 5, and plus wife. So you're talking about 500,000 people coming in all at the same time. And also the security checks and everything else. The jihadists were on this. Chaos is a ladder for them. That's where they sneak in and get over. There's all sorts of different stories. I've heard of hotels where someone had come and had 2 kilos of heroin. It's just like, not all the people coming through were good guys. And so, yeah, they were struggling because that's what happens. A year later, we were taking in hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian women and their children, and trying to find housing for them. That's another story in itself. So that didn't help. But do you know something? When you're talking about cross-departmental stuff between state and defence and everything, you will always get barriers and problems and whatever, and that just happens. But it's beginning to move now for the triples. We've basically sorted out the British nationals, so they were sorted out pretty quickly. There were a lot of British nationals, and that's really where the first start of our work happened, which is trying to get people out of the country who had a right, who had a British passport, etc. But trying to get them from the four ends of Afghanistan into the bar and hotel to get them on a flight. That was pretty ropey.
Sure. When I first started getting involved in Afghanistan research, I'd say, because I was a college student, so I wasn't doing anything other than writing reports for professors, or doing internships in DC. But that was such a huge issue then. Interagency coordination was absolutely hindering our ability to be successful in Afghanistan. And so to see it continue to be a problem in the aftermath, like, we didn't learn that lesson at the time, that you need to have the ability to communicate between departments and not have information siloed and be able to make decisions. Like, we need to learn that skill. It's a very important skill, but obviously it's difficult, but it is frustrating when lives are on the line. And I've seen the same videos you have, not of the Triples, but of Special Forces personnel. I mean, one of the first people I interviewed about this just sent me a trove of videos and pictures that turned my stomach, and it's very difficult to watch. But I want to talk about a happy story. You sent me, I mean, it doesn't start happy. This is going to not sound happy when I set it up, but you sent me an amazing article about a child who was left behind in Afghanistan by a parent who had to get out of there, and it is harrowing up until the end, but I promise there is a happy ending for listeners. I'm not setting up a horrible story here. I would love you, Art, to tell that story from start to finish, because it's really just an incredible example of what happened in the midst of all of this unforeseen chaos.
Well, all I say is saddle up and get your coffee on, because it's a bit of a long and quite convoluted. One of the most difficult extractions I had to do was a British national who had a passport, who had the right to come to this country, and it took over a year. But it's more complex. So basically, I'll start off in what I will call the 1997 generation of Afghans before 2021 who came over illegally, who sought asylum. There was a chap in Northampton called Wahid, who's an older guy, and Wahid, a couple of years before the extraction, went over, before the fall of Kabul, went over to Kabul and got married to a woman, went back to the UK. So obviously she couldn't, even though she was married to him, he had to go through the process of getting a spousal visa, going through all the checks. It's an expensive process, it's time consuming, etc. And while she was there in Kabul, she was living with her brother at the time in Kabul, she was pregnant with her now first son called Mustafa. And the plan was to get her spousal visa sorted so that she could come over and join him. And now these guys, look, let's be honest about it, these are not high flying execs or whatever. These are not people that work in IT or anything. You know, Wahid was working on like minimum wage jobs, etc. I don't know what he was doing. He had a council house here. So that when the spousal visa came through, they took a decision for her to go over, for Mustafa to stay with her brother in Kabul. He would look after, you know, this is how it works, and do it stage by stage. Get an application, because he didn't have he had a right of a British passport. She had indefinite leave to remain, which came after actually. He had no passport. He was 2 years of age. While she came over to, when she came over to Northampton, once that visa had been granted, COVID happened, and Wahid caught COVID and died. So there she was, a few months in Northampton, spoke no English, only Dari. Husband had died. She's pregnant again. She's in a council house. She's not paying any rent. She's not paying any bills. She doesn't speak the language. She has no right to that council house. The council then takes steps to basically evict her while she was pregnant, and at the same time, in August, he's just turned 2 years of age, the fall of Afghanistan. And it was like, oh my God, this was, whoa, this was just, it pulled at the heartstrings, but I thought this would be pretty easy to deal with. So he was issued with his passport, I think on the 3rd of September. But we made approaches to Lord Ahmed in the Foreign Office. We were trying to get this sorted. Let's get this kid extracted. But the Foreign Office we just getting nowhere. They weren't even answering. I got this cut and paste response from Lord Ahmed, who was the minister responsible. His civil servants wrote this. Did manage to escalate it a bit. The problem was they said, well, we can't take him out because he's got no passport. Well, we said, well, if you can get him out, then that's fine, but we can't do that. If he doesn't have a passport, he doesn't have the right. So many sort of complications. So we kept going on to anyone that would listen, trying to basically escalate his case. But the first thing we had to do was to make sure that Nadia, the mother, was not kicked out of her apartment. It's coming up to Christmas. She's been given a letter to bailiffs are coming to the door to extract her, or almost there. It was coming up to Christmas. She was heavily pregnant, spoke no English, and it's just like, and this is where the networks come on. The CEO of the council house organisation, a guy called Mike, lovely guy, had a real. So we have this system in place where we get lots of letters and we get lots of emails to do about housing. I'm homeless. I need help with housing. I need a transfer, etc. And we would put that through the housing organisation. But we had a nice understanding that if something came our way that was like, I would send a note. And I would do that through his PA. Just said like, Mike, I need you to look at this one. I need you to look at this one. And it was fraught because it was very complicated, because had he not died, he would have lost the council houses, because typical clan mentality of the Afghans, and I don't know the ins and the outs, but apparently he had signed off that he was the owner of another property amongst with someone. I don't know if he just signed that just to get the signature. Who knows, don't care, but he was going to be turfed out anyway. Caught COVID, died. And that was it. It was further complicated because after he had died, Nadia's father, that lived off in I think Jalalabad or Nangarhar, somewhere like that, wanted her to come back to Afghanistan so he could marry her off. So he was using the child as leverage. So we had to get that child out, Mustafa out, without having the father involved. If he got a sniff of that, then it was game over for us, because in Afghan law, if a father dies, the child becomes the property of the next male heir, and that would be the father of Nadia. And even if he died, then it would be a brother or something like that. So the brother was in on this with us, and he was taking care, and he knew that Mustafa had to get back. So Kush, the leader of the local Afghan community, we managed to smuggle his passport through Pakistan. So we managed to set all of that up. We just took the passport and we just said, like, to hell with it, let's get it over. Got it over through a businessman going over to Islamabad, local Pakistani businessman, got someone to pick it up at the border, drive the 8 hours from Islamabad, get it up to Torkan, get it across, sneak it in and get it back up to Kabul. But that was only the start of our problems, because then we had to find a way of getting him out. And time was taking on, lots going on. Then we got some help with the Human First Coalition, which is Safi Ralph. Awesome guy. Had him and his brother and a couple of Brits stayed behind, even though he was ex-American Special Forces and he ended up getting arrested and imprisoned by the Taliban and spent about a couple of 100 days in a Taliban prison and things. But in behind the background, he was working to try, and the idea was that we would get the money together. Once the money had gone together, I would get temporary custody assigned to Safi through a notary, through a lawyer friend of mine who did it free. Thank you, Michael. And then Safi would take him as far as UAE, and then we would get him to London, and that would be it. But then they all got cold feet, so they secured the money for it. And it came from, like I say, American investors. Meghan Markle and Prince Harry were involved in some way. I don't ask any questions, but lots of funds were coming around and they were trying to get people out. And but finally, the whole issue about they didn't know anything about the grandfather. And when that came, it was like real cold feet, because Safi and anyone in the Human First Coalition would have ended up back in a prison if they even got a sniff of that. So they were like, whoa, we can't do this. So it took to September of 2022, and it all happened really fast. There was a Afghan grandmother that travelled post-fall of Kabul via Qatar into Kabul, was off to see her family, and agreed to take him. We didn't even have the custody or anything, but it was all very, very much touch and go. Mustafa got to the airport with the family, with this woman. He didn't know this woman. This woman spoke Pashto and didn't speak any Dari. So this is like, they couldn't even communicate. So they were trying to basically say that everything was fine, I'm just taking him out. We didn't know if we were we knew that some of the airport workers were not pro-Taliban and things that would help ease the way and things. But the human first people got him into the airport, and one of them wanted to take a photograph of Mustafa and things, and the Taliban just came on them. What are you doing? What are you doing taking photographs? What's happening here? Whatever. And it looked like he wasn't going to make it. This had been over a year, and you would have thought it would have been easy to get, but the Foreign Office didn't want to go and try and smuggle in a passport. They didn't want anything to do with that, and we just did it. And finally, then in September 2022, we all drove down to Heathrow Airport and picked him up, and very emotional. I had my camera with me because I'm a bit of a photographer, and I took some photographs. It was really, really emotional because mother and child. Because I know, I don't know you, Beth, but I know that you would crawl over broken glass to do anything for your own child. So to see a mother who was very vulnerable and her child who was 3, who had never really got to know the mother and met his baby sister, it made it worth it for me. Like the Torah says, you save one, you save a nation.
I can't tell you how many times I've used that Torah verse in this podcast. Because that is what everybody was doing, right? Every small evacuation, every, helping somebody get their paperwork done, every air app, triples person that you've helped, that's all changing a life, saving a life, and it makes a world of difference every time. So it's just really incredible to hear that. And I think that leads to, I have 2 other questions for you, and they kind of wrap everything together. I want to know when you look back at your involvement in this, what impact has it had on your life? Good, bad, other, moral injury? I don't want to suppose that I know anything about that, but I want to hear from you all of those things, what this has done for you as a person.
I think, I've got close contact and contacts with British military, people who have served not just in Afghanistan but in Northern Ireland, in Iraq, and various other places and things. And I've met some amazing people at the time. I met and I've read books about them, and I've actually met people who come from very humble beginnings, council house, projects, as you would call them, or whatever, will come from immigrant families. They join up something like the U.S. Marine Corps, the U.S. Air Force, or the American Army, and it's the making of them, because what the Army and the military does is give them a framework. It gives them a sense of purpose, and it gives them a sense of integrity, I think, as well. Or purpose and dignity are the 2 things that they can sort of lean in and whatever. I worked with a lot of organizations throughout Europe, throughout the world, had meetings with the Moral Compass Federation with Travis Peterson, had one meeting trying to get visas. We never got that. It was exploratory meetings. I met Ben Owen from Flanders Field. All of these people, amazing people, Hungarian military intelligence officers that served in Polycomrie, etc. People dotted around, and some people still involved in intelligence work. I've met brigadiers and got friendly with people in special for all of these people and things like that. And just at that moment of history, it'll never be written in a book or anything, but I just know that it is something that I can go back on and basically say that I did something purposely for humanity. In a little way, I was part of something that made a difference. It's like the old West Wing. There's a scene in the West Wing where it's dealing with Jed Bartlett's daughters. And so, when she was younger, she was on a beach, and there were all these starfish from a storm. There was like thousands of them on the beach, and she was going picking them up and throwing them back into the water. And he was going, "Hey, honey, you're not going to save everything." And she said, "No, but for this one, that will make the change." And I always remember that in the West Wing, being a bit of a political bod and whatever, watching all of those things. And so I made a difference, and I expanded my envelope. I stepped across a red line, and I was glad to sort of do that. You know, when I was a younger guy, I was quite left wing, growing up in Northern Ireland, and you know, and if I were looking back at my left wing self in my teenage years, full of optimism, my God, I would be woke if it were now. Oh God, it doesn't even bother. I think now I'm a conservative, you know, more right of centre or organised, you know. But what I do like to think of is that the compassion in my humanity as a right-winger conservative sort of guy is more there in terms of when it came down. I stepped forward at that, but it just wasn't me. It was like lots of people putting stuff together, and some stuff I only had a little part in it, but it managed just to give it a little bit of momentum. And yeah, so that's been the impact about 3 years on. So I can sort of go and just take a nod to the odd time and just, but I'm in awe of people who serve in the military or the police or whatever for, and I've known people. I mean, a friend of mine who's a former major in the paratroop had 3 tours in 4 years at the time where it was they were in some heavy combat on a daily basis, and that took a toll on him. And I know coming up to Christmas, he's lost some people. And yeah, not a good time. He had to be medically discharged because of PTSD. I don't have any of that or whatever. So it's just a nod to people. You know, if he watches this podcast, he'll know who I'm talking about and whatever. But those people are just, you know, I don't worship people in that or whatever. But just a nod that you do something exceptional. That even for years in your military life can be purposed in weeks of something. You know, people forget that D-Day or Arnhem, Bridge Too Far, whatever, was all just, you know, a few weeks of heavy intense periods, and then not. So I just, yeah, so it's been interesting and finding out how the world actually works and what it means to make a difference and see a wider picture. So I tend to be a little bit less dogmatic and open. You know, I've done other stuff as well. Tried to help get a Gazan journalist who was pro-Hamas out on a health issue, and you know, just helping ease the way or whatever. It's not up for me. I let the authorities deal with that, and I just like push it that way, or something like that. So yeah, so and that part of Afghanistan, because of the technology, because of WhatsApp, because you could see pictures, because you were seeing live time of the things that were happening there, and that connection, it never really leaves you. And you know, I'm old. I'm in my 50s. I'm not like a 20-year-old that has to have a photograph with someone famous or a politician or something. I don't have to write everything down or whatever. It's just knowing that I've done it, that I did a good thing, you know, and that's worth it.
Yeah, the peace within yourself of knowing that you were part of something really incredible, and it was. Everyone I talked to, it changed their lives, and I wasn't involved in those early days, but I certainly got involved in the aftermath, and it changed my life. I don't recognize the person I used to be, and I'm grateful for that. I like this person who, it's like you said, I was a very conservative person before I came into this. My story is a little bit different, but I could care less about politics anymore. I want to know about the people. I want to see policies that help people, and I just look at news stories differently. You know, where is the pain that's coming from this, and how do we fix it instead of just screaming at each other across the aisle, because that is not how things change. I've seen too how you get things to change, and it's not screaming across the aisle or trying to rile somebody up. That doesn't do anything, and I have no time for that anymore. But yeah, it was an incredible time. The last question I have for you is, I know you have really strong feelings about the fallout of Afghanistan and what those consequences have been for the world at large. And I'd love for you to talk a bit about those consequences and why it's important to talk about them now.
Yeah, I mean, I follow geopolitics, I follow international relations. It interests me because of the complexity, some of the unknown parts of it. You know, you think you become an expert. I'm not an expert on Afghanistan or anything, or whatever, or Syria or any. I have an interest in it. Unfortunately, now not working in Parliament, I don't get all the interest in like BBC monitoring all the daily intelligence brief from the press and things like that. So I'm sort of a little bit out of it. I don't blame President Biden solely 100% in terms of, you know, again, it comes back to the military, whether in Iraq or in Afghanistan or whatever. Politicians sometimes go in gung-ho, or they get the military, they go in and they make huge mistakes. Iraq, I think, is one of them. They just stirred up a hornet's nest, Paul Bremer or whatever. The good thing is that people like David Petraeus, Ray Ordinero in Iraq, or Stanley McChrystal, all of these people, they're left there to find the solutions, etc., along with people like Emma Sky. There's so many different people, civilians, military, to find out a solution to the quagmire, and they will stay the distance. So that's why I like the military, because they will stay the distance unless otherwise ordered to. But the withdrawal was a failure. And it goes back to George W. Bush, President Obama, President Trump, all had a part to play in little things that you didn't see at the time, but you realize contributed to that. The Taliban realizing through all the blood and sweat that NATO forces had to create this relatively stable country. For all of that, they had done all the heavy shifting. To me, it was like the Vietnam War. They had the wrong strategy. And by the time they had the correct strategy, and I believe actually that the US military could have won Vietnam, but the political will had gone. Nixon had called a line, drew a line on it. They were getting out, that was it. And something similar happened in Afghanistan. Because, you know, we forget, we still have American troops. We still have Allied troops in Syria. We still have Allied troops, small deposits of Allied troops in, I mean, not even just in Iraq, but we have Australian and New Zealanders in Malaysia. From the Malay emergency back in the 1950s, we still have troops in South Korea, minimum footprints. And the geopolitics that interests me is that we had an interesting thing is happening in a global shift. One is that globalist Islam, so ISIS, Al-Qaeda, generally speaking, the jihadist threat is still there. It is morphing and is mutating. It's spread over to Africa through the Sahel, but it's different than ISIS and Al-Qaeda. Globalist jihadism is on the wane. It's retreating, right? The jihadism that we're having now is Al-Jalani in Syria, it's Boko Haram. They're territorialists. They're like the Taliban. They just want to have the territory and whatever regime. They're not interested in bombing shopping malls in Washington or anything like that. However, in Afghanistan, we now have, I think, estimated over 30 Al-Qaeda camps. The Haqqani network, which is the dominant part of that, they are global jihadists. They're operating with Al-Qaeda. Hassan bin Laden was in the Panjshir Valley. They're organizing. They're getting ready. They're getting ready to launch, trying to look at, I've seen some reports of targeting Germany, France, and United Kingdom. Some people are in there. They still have skin in the game in that sense. Had we not have left, had we have held on to Bagram Airport, or just keep that minimal stuff and made, I'm very much politically into signals, which is I might or might not hit you. I might bomb you, I might not. But if you cross this, I might give you a red line, I might not. But that uncertainty, but if you give that impression that you're not going to leave Afghanistan, that would change the entire strategy of the Taliban. And it might have brought them into talks. More American soldiers were killed post 2012, killed in car accidents than they were in Afghanistan than before, or, you know, civilian accidents and things like that. So for me, you give up a lot, because think about how it all sort of works out. You've got Russia in problems now. The problem started from 1990. They do not have the power to hang on to provide security to the Central Asian states of Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, etc. China has more influence in that area. Afghanistan borders that. You have an American presence in Bagram Airport. That makes a difference in the calculations. Prevention deters or whatever, and weakness provokes, as they normally say. So it's sad that all the hard work had done, the deaths, everything, the carnage, the injuries, the moral injuries, all of this had happened, and you'd sort of steadied it a bit. I don't know, but again, I come back to saying this, Beth. These are not certainties. Maybe even if we had decided to stay, it would all sort of go on the loof or whatever. But I find it a little bit sad that you get there, that you could have just, American government. I see the reports of like intelligence people actually in country, money being paid into the Taliban or whatever to allegedly into the Taliban to pay for, and sharing of intelligence to ISIS-K, and then you have Haqqani network people that join ISIS-K, then come out and go back to Haqqanis and swap them. I know this is familiar territory. Saw this in Northern Ireland. People would join the IRA and then get pissed off and move on to the INLA and then go back, or they would go off somewhere else. UVF joined the LVF or another faction, and all the rest of it. I see that, I understand that, and things. I just think it is quite sad in itself, and the world is becoming a more dangerous place, and that part now we just don't have the intelligence coming out. We don't have those relationships, corrupt as Ghani was or whatever, but I just felt that we should have stayed, but we didn't, and that's it. So what do we need to do now? Well, firstly, I've just finished off on this, Beth. Things are different in 1997. 1997, Kabul only had about, I think the highest rise building they had was 2 stories. That's different now. Technology has changed the way I interface with Afghanistan, and also interface. I go to a local kebab shop or whatever, all the guys behind there are all Panjshiris. So they get all the stuff that's happening in all the camps up in the mountains with the Panjshiris. We get all of that real-time information. We talk. There is a generation of Afghans in the States and in Britain. In 20 years' time, they will be going to Harvard. Some of them will go to Harvard. Some of them will go to Oxford, Cambridge, etc. They will get involved in politics, government, business, etc. And there will be 100-fold of the Hamid Kazis in a different way. It's a different dynamic in a connected world. Those women who now have to cover up or whatever still have the mobile phone in their house and can still have a look out on the outer world and can see that it's a different place. Taliban won't last forever, so we need to have a serious think now about how we organise should a crisis arrive back in Afghanistan or that area of the country. It could be Pakistan, who knows, but we need to have a real thought out on that, and this time not follow through. We got 85% of the way there, and then we retreated back to 10%.
Yeah, you just wrapped that up very well, and I agree. I say that often. The Taliban can't stay forever. Hate doesn't get to stick around, and there are too many people who are getting educated, who do care, who just now they can't say anything, but there will be a time when they can. There will be a time when the women can stand up and say, no more. We don't give you the authority to do this to us anymore. Well, Art, it has been really fantastic to hear even more of your story today. I want to thank you so much for being here, for talking about what you've been doing. It's been really inspirational, and I've loved every minute of it. And I'm sure that listeners are feeling the same way, however they're tuning in.
Cool, thank you very much. The pleasure's all mine. Thanks very much. You'll find me on LinkedIn. Hook up, have a chat. Love to hear about your experiences in Afghanistan. And if you need any help, if you've got any, I might be able to sort of have a look at something and put you in contact with someone that might be of help. But thank you very much. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Well, it's been great to have you. And Art, I know that you're going to be inundated. I can tell you that right now. There are going to be people asking you for help, and it's nice. It always feels good when you can get somebody that connection that they need. So I'm hoping that something great is going to come out of this, and I just want to once again say to Afghan listeners, we always want to tell your stories on the podcast. You can submit them through the Afghanistan Project Podcast at gmail.com. Tell us about any part of your experience, anything. It's all open, and of course we will give you anonymity so that you can be protected and not have to worry about the Taliban finding you or identifying you, or anyone. If you want to say things about the U.S. government, I will not out you to the U.S. government. To all listeners, thanks for sharing your time, for supporting the people of Afghanistan. Tashakor, and hope to see you again soon.